I'm Linda Duguay, the Director of the Environmental Studies Program here at USC, and also the Executive Director for the Tyler Prize. And I'm delighted to invite you all here to this 28th annual celebration of the Tyler Prize awarding. And we have with us our 48th and 49th Tyler laureates. They're going to be introduced. I'm just up here for a moment to sort of welcome you and greet you. And our laureates are going to be introduced by Dr. Donald Manahan, the Letters, Arts, and Sciences Dean for Research. And Donald's also a biologist who just recently became our dean in September, and we're delighted that he's here with us and that he was willing to take this opportunity to introduce our two laureates. Donald's sort of traveled through a very different continent than the one these two gentlemen are going to be talking about today. Is sort of at sort of one of the opposites. Donald spent a great deal of his time conducting research and education on the continent of Antarctica, very different than what our two laureates will be talking about today. So without further ado, Donald Manahan.
Thank you very much, Linda. Normally, when you introduce colleagues at any seminar, you can kind of wing it. You know, so I came from here, did a PhD there, did a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But as you look to see what these two remarkable gentlemen have done, it's really remarkable, the extent of their work, the breadth of their work, the impact of their work. So I took the liberty, and you'll forgive me, of taking a few notes on the subject to make sure I hit what I consider some of the highlights. This year's Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement has been awarded jointly to Dr. Gerard Diamond and Dr. Thomas Lovejoy to honor them for their pioneering work in the field of conservation biology. Dr. Gerard Diamond is a professor of physiology at UCLA's School of Medicine and has made very broad and very, very distinguished indeed contributions to fundamental areas including ecological research, public understanding of biodiversity, and conservation practice. Dr. Diamond has had a remarkable career and is a leader in these different fields, which include ecology, physiology, conservation biology, human history, and the understanding of environmental problems. He is also famous for two great books: The Third Chimpanzee, which puts humanity into an evolutionary perspective, and Guns, Germs, and Steel, a profound explanation of why civilization evolved down such different paths. Both these books received numerous awards, including a Pulitzer Prize for Guns, Germs, and Steel. Dr. Diamond's studies on bird diversity in New Guinea's tropical rainforests have made central contributions to our understanding of species coexistence and evolution. He is considered a founder of the science of conservation biology, and his work has provided the theoretical justification for large nature reserves. Dr. Diamond has also played a critical role in helping the governments of Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands to conserve their biodiversity. He has been elected a member of the United States National Academy of Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Thomas Lovejoy is a senior scientist at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and plays a major role as the biodiversity advisor to the World Bank. He is one of the world's leading environmental problem solvers. Indeed, he's one of the very first presidents of the Society for Conservation Biology. Dr. Lovejoy conceived the idea of a minimum critical size of ecosystems and involved this into the world's largest controlled experiment as part of a research project on this theme. Now, what this project is about is a study of the capacity of forest fragments of varying sizes to sustain biological diversity. And this project has shown that more species are protected in a single large reserve than are protected in several smaller reserves, even though the total area in both experiments is the same. This finding had immense practical implications for the design and management of parks and reserves. Dr. Lovejoy is often credited with coining the term biological diversity, or biodiversity as it's commonly known today. And this is a concept that has come to play a vital role in the public policy of many nations. In addition, the concept of debt for nature swaps was entirely Dr. Lovejoy's idea. This is the notion of allowing developing nations to convert some of their foreign debt to local currency investments. This has proven a most useful strategy for stimulating conservation programs in developing countries. For example, Brazil has agreed to do a $100 million debt for nature swap. And over lunch today, Dr. Lovejoy informed me that he thinks the total of this investment is now in the region of $1 billion. Dr. Lovejoy has earned a reputation for being particularly skilled and effective in bridging the gaps that so often exist between science and public policy. His work has had major impacts on the policies and practices of government with respect to biodiversity and the conservation of tropical forests. So what we're going to do this afternoon is have the pleasure of hearing Dr. Diamond and Dr. Lovejoy explain some of their work, how they got to where they are at this point in their careers. We're going to do this in alphabetical order, and we'll start with Dr. Diamond. Thank you.
Will you be able to hear me okay in back? Can you hear in back? Good. Well, it is obviously a great pleasure for me to be here, especially under these circumstances of receiving the Tyler Prize. It's a prize on which I have some personal and historical perspective because I've been at a number of the award events, including the very first one to Evelyn Hutchinson, whom Tom also knows very well. And while it would, under any circumstances, be a pleasure and honor to receive the Tyler Prize, it's especially so to receive it jointly with Tom. As the members of the Tyler Prize Committee know very well, Tom has inspired and instructed my own work for the past 25 years, but the committee may not have known that Tom has inspired and instructed me and my wife in another respect, namely that both Tom and I are the parents of same-sex twins, but that Tom became the parent of same-sex twins 19 years before I did. And so in the first year, while working in New Guinea rainforest can be excruciatingly difficult, it is nothing compared to being parents of twins in the first year. And Tom was able to offer Marie and me some valuable advice on how to do it. Well, I thought that I would like to share with you today the history by which I came to work in ecology and conservation biology, because it's a convoluted route. I was born in 1937, and that meant that I went to college in the 1950s at a time when ecology was not considered an exciting or central discipline, and indeed tropical biology was considered hopelessly complex. In the 1950s and early 1960s, young ecologists were told to go study supposedly simple temperate zone ecosystems and not to attempt to study the tropics, which were just beyond us. And so it's not that I considered going into ecology and conservation biology and rejected the idea. It's that it never occurred to me as a career choice. Instead, because my father was a physician, and I, for a long time, planned to go to medical school, I decided in my last year of college to do the next closest thing, to get my PhD in physiology, the area in which I was then hired by UCLA, for which I'm paid by UCLA, and which I've continued to do research and teaching. And in fact, my UCLA physiology colleagues I've seen are in the audience today. The research that we do in our laboratory consists presently of projects on the metabolic physiology of Peromyscus dia mice, on rate-limiting steps in total parenteral nutrition, and on evolution of maximal body size. And next Monday, I begin doing what UCLA pays me to do, namely to give lectures to first-year medical students on the absorptive and secretory physiology of the pancreas, stomach, and intestine. But when I was 7 years old, I became a bird watcher, and my father, who was a professor at Harvard, had a collaborative project with Ernst Mayr, the great ornithologist, evolutionary biologist, who had done field work in New Guinea. And so in 1963, after I'd gotten my PhD, a Harvard classmate of mine, John Terborg, he and I, both being unattached young bachelors, wanted adventure, and so we cooked up our first experience in the tropics, a trip to Peru to climb mountains and then go into the Amazon basin, where we found there wasn't much to do except hang out with Indians and watch birds. And so the next year, we then cooked up an even more adventurous project to go to New Guinea and study birds seriously. At the end of that second project in New Guinea, any of you who know John and me, you'll know that both of us have our ideas about how to do things. And it became clear that Peru was not large enough to hold both of us, nor was New Guinea. John declared that he was going to continue working in Peru, and he explained to me that the reason that Peru attracted him more than New Guinea, what attracted him about Peru was its political stability. Classic example of the right decision for the wrong reason. And since John had claimed Peru, that left New Guinea to me. Since then, I've made a total of 19 trips to study bird community ecology and to practice conservation biology in New Guinea. It was in New Guinea in early February. I was there in January and February for trip number 19. That's where I learned of the Tyler Prize, sitting under the tin roof of an oil exploration camp in the wettest place in the world, annual rainfall between 300 and 800 inches of rain per year, and at night with the rain pounding down with deafening sounds on the tin roof, I received an email from my wife Marie, and in line number 10, it said, "You've received the Tyler Prize," in full caps, exclamation, exclamation, exclamation mark. Well, New Guinea, it was love at first sight. New Guinea is objectively viewed the most beautiful, intense place in the world. It has a range of habitats from coral reefs to glaciers because the elevations are up to 16,500 feet on the equator. It has large expanses of relatively undisturbed rainforest. It has what any ornithologist would agree are the world's most beautiful and interesting birds, the birds of paradise and bowerbirds. It has fascinating people who until recently were dependent upon stone tools, and some of whom are still practicing tribal warfare, and from whom one can learn all sorts of interesting things that you'll never learn in the United States. For example, one of my drivers on this trip to New Guinea in January has still been participating recently in intertribal warfares and told me what it is like to kill another man with bow and arrow. You can't learn that in Los Angeles. New Guineans speak a total of 1,000 different languages. 1/6 of the world's languages are confined to New Guinea, and they are just walking encyclopedias of information about natural history. Working in New Guinea is often very uncomfortable, it's occasionally dangerous, and it's frequently worrisome. When I'm working in New Guinea, often my attention is not fully on the birds because I'm worried about what's going to happen tomorrow, will this come off, etc., etc. But when I'm not worrying, it is an incredibly gorgeous place. And there is just nothing like walking along a road or trail through New Guinea rainforest before dawn, an hour before dawn, when it's still dark and the Southern Cross is overhead, and you can see the silhouettes of the great jungle trees and listen to the calls of the bubuk owls and the frogmouths and the New Guinea harpy eagle and the brush turkeys and the corals. When it's gorgeous, it is really gorgeous. And so a unfortunate consequence of that is, by comparison, life in Los Angeles just feels unreal to me. Although nowadays I spend only 5 weeks every year and a half in New Guinea, emotionally I'm half New Guinean. Well, between 1964 and 1974, what I did in New Guinea was just basic research on bird communities. I studied niche partitioning, altitudinal segregation, speciation, colonization, and community assembly. I had the good fortune in the 1960s to meet the great ecologist Robert MacArthur in the last years before his death, and was influenced by him and encouraged by Robert to start publishing. But eventually the governments of the New Guinea region began to expect visiting researchers not just to drop in and go away leaving nothing, but the governments began to expect benefits from the work of these foreign visitors. And at the same time, I began to be increasingly upset and just outraged at the destruction of the rainforest and birds that I so loved. In 1976, on my 76 trip, it all clicked. I was going to study birds for several months in the Solomon Islands, and I received a request from the government of the Solomon Islands to please visit Rennell Island, an island in the Solomons which is the world's biggest uplifted coral atoll. It's basically a coral reef that was lifted 600 feet into the air, so the old lagoon is now the largest freshwater lake in the Pacific. Rennell Island has the most distinctive endemic bird fauna of any island of its size in the Pacific. It has the world's only landlocked sea snakes, and it's got pygmy ibis and pygmy cormorant. But Rennell also has a lot of bauxite, and Mitsubishi had a proposal to the Solomons government to establish what was going to be the biggest development project of the Solomon government, mining bauxite on Rennell Island, putting in roads to extract the bauxite, and the forestry department of the Solomons government said that as long as the roads were being put in, why didn't they take advantage of the roads to log the forest of Rennell in which Rennell's endemic birds lived? Well, the Solomon Islands are a really poor country. They did not have enough funds to do an environmental impact survey of their biggest development project, but the South Pacific Commission had given the Solomon government $1,000. So the Solomon government told me, here's $1,000, go to Rennell for a week, do an environmental impact study, and come back and tell us everything we need to know to evaluate the project. So I went to Rennell, and it immediately became obvious that there had been essentially no regrowth of vegetation on the trial mining sites that Mitsubishi had set up, and that bauxite mining places great demands on fresh water supplies, that the Solomons government was planning to build its largest city on Rennell Island, but that there was no surface water on Rennell. All really simple stuff, but this cash-starved government had not been able to do even the briefest environmental impact study to evaluate it. And so when I came back to Honiara, the capital, at the end of that week and told them these obvious things, the bauxite mining project on Rennell Island was canceled, and so the unique fauna of Rennell is still intact today. And that was an eye-opener for me because it made it clear that one person really can make the difference, particularly if you are in an area where there are few experts and where there's not much advice available to the government. I went on to draw up national park plans for the governments of the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. And then in the year 1979 came another one of these $1,000 experiences. It was also my first experience with World Wildlife Fund. I was invited to Indonesia, which owns the western half of the island of New Guinea. The Indonesian government had been setting up national parks, and in 1979 they were finally ready to set up a national park system in Indonesian New Guinea, but they had to sort out competing claims between conservation and mining and logging. So the Indonesian government told World Wildlife, which in turn told me, here is $1,000 and a month. At the end of this month, we, the Indonesian government, are going to decide on land use planning for Indonesian New Guinea. And no, you do not have time to do detailed studies. Whatever is known at the end of a month, that's the information that's going to go into the design of the national park system. But we, the Indonesian government, are prepared to set aside 20% of the area of Indonesian New Guinea. That's about 30,000 square miles for national parks. Please tell us where you would like your national parks. And so I took the $1,000 and chartered helicopters and went into two places, and for a month I surveyed a couple of previously unknown areas, used my previous knowledge about the biogeography of Indonesian New Guinea to design a national park system that covered all of the major centers of endemism in Indonesian New Guinea, and thank God the system was largely adopted. Since then, from 1979 onwards until 1996, I surveyed one after another of the individual national parks in Indonesian New Guinea. 79 also began the beginning of my involvement with World Wildlife Fund, with which Tom has also been even more closely involved. World Wildlife Fund is, I believe, the world's largest international conservation organization that is responsible for a great blend of cutting-edge conservation biology and cutting-edge science, learning new things about science that are important in designing conservation strategies. And so during the last decade, I've also been a director of World Wildlife Fund. since 1998, I've been involved in a unique partnership between World Wildlife Fund and a big oil company, Chevron, because Chevron is managing the largest oil field in New Guinea, the Kakori oil fields of Papua New Guinea, and that has been another eye-opener to me, going out there thinking that oil companies are evil, and the only question was going to be, how bad is the situation going to be inside the oil field? And instead discovering that big corporations have enormous capacity to do harm, but also when they want to, they have enormous capacity to do good. And it turns out that the Kakori oil fields are micromanaged with a rigor that you see in no national park. The oil fields are by far effectively the best national park in the whole Pacific, because there aren't any oil derricks and there are not access roads. It's all done by helicopter with just incredible environmental safeguards. The remaining transforming experience for me came in 1987, 19 years after Tom, and that was the birth of my twin children. When my first, second, and last children were born then in 1987, that transformed my outlook, because one hears all these things about things that are going to happen, environmental problems that will loom up in the year 2050 or 2040 or 2030, global warming, destruction of the rainforest, exhaustion of fossil fuel supplies. And having been born in 1937 myself, the year 2050 was an imaginary date to me. I couldn't care less about what was going to happen in 2050 until my boys were born. And when they were born, I realized that since I'm now 63, the year 2050, that's 20 years after the end of the rainforest, the year 2050 is when my boys are going to be my present age. And I realized it's not enough for my wife and me to work for the individual futures of my boys, agonizing about what schools they're going to go to and whether we've drawn up our wills correctly. Because, in fact, the future of my boys was going to be settled not only by the life insurance that we took out, but even more by the shape of the world around them. And that was a lesson that I was predisposed to recognize, because I was born in 1937 and I lived in Europe for 4.5 years, it means that some of my closest friends are Germans and Yugoslavs and Russians and British and Poles, and these are, so my friends born in 1937 are people whose world collapsed around them. And then I married into a Polish family that went through various negative experiences during the war. So all this conditioned me to realize that if what you want to do is ensure the future of your children, it's not enough to take out a life insurance policy on them. You have to make sure that the world does not come crashing down around them as it did during the Second World War. For my cohort, what came crashing down was because of war. For my children's cohort, what may come crashing down is less likely to be war than the growing environmental catastrophes that most of us in this room are concerned with. And so I decided that besides writing the life insurance premiums, I had to do something to shape the world of my children. And I felt that for me, what I could do most effectively was communicate to the public, write for the public about environmental problems, to try to sensitize the public to the problems that were going to shape the future of my children's generation. And so, beginning in 1991, I've written, or I am writing, 4 books for the public. One, The Third Chimpanzee, about human origins from animal precursors. The second, Guns, Germs, and Steel, about the environmental influences in the rise of civilizations. The third, fortunately, my least successful book, entitled Why is Sex Fun?, about the evolution of human sexuality. Less successful partly because after 170 pages, I still couldn't figure out why is sex fun. And then the book that I'm working on at present, about all those past societies that collapsed because of problems in managing their environment, and about the lessons for our times. What can we learn today as we risk mismanaging our environment? What can we learn about all the past societies that collapsed for those reasons? And in addition, I'm now writing regular columns in Natural History magazine and sporadically in Nature magazine, and giving lectures to try to sensitize the public to these environmental issues. What does the Tyler Prize mean to me? Concretely, when I heard the dollar value involved, I immediately translated, that's the next 2.5 New Guinea expeditions. But it means something more. It's also a recognition of the value of academic scientists contributing to public understanding of big problems, big environmental problems, including problems with the world's richest and most gorgeous environments, the tropical rainforests. And I keep reflecting that in the case of Rennell Island, it may well have been the case that if I had not spent that 1 week on Rennell Island, the forest of Rennell Island would now be planed, the Mitsubishi bauxite mines would be in there, and the 5 endemic bird species and 20 endemic subspecies of Rennell Island would now be extinct or on their way out. So the overall message is one person really can make a difference, and I hope that the example of the Tyler Prize will broadcast this message. I'm honored to be a recipient, and I'm honored to be a co-recipient with someone whom I so admire and enjoy, Tom Lovejoy.
Well, first of all, let me just say a word about the joy of sharing this with Jared. You didn't get to find out right away, but I shared that joy with Marie. Jared has been an amazing inspiration to many people, including myself. And his studies of the relationship of species numbers, etc., to islands was very formative in leading me to initiate the main part of my scientific work. But he's also just this amazingly versatile guy. And one time I went to a big science meeting in Arizona, I think it was Arizona, and Jared was giving one of the featured talks, and I showed up at 8 o'clock in the morning for it with dozens and dozens of others, and it turned out the title in the program, which was about species relationships to islands, was not what he was going to talk about. He was going to talk about physiology. And so there was a mass exodus from the room. But I decided to stay and listen. And I won't claim that I got all of it, but it was, not surprisingly, an amazing lecture. Of course, it is an enormous honor to receive the Tyler Prize, as well as a joy to receive it with Jared, to join with so many illustrious figures like Sherry Rowland here is special too, but it is particularly meaningful for me because I did my PhD under G. Evelyn Hutchinson, who received the prize the very first year. And because he was nominated by one of his just recent PhDs, namely Tom Lovejoy. So there's a wonderful sort of personal closing of a circle here. So what about my personal Odyssey? It is alleged that it started when I was about the age of 4, when my uncle and my father were discussing a broadcast by Edward R. Murrow from London in the post-war years. And when I interrupted and said, let's talk about something interesting, like skunks or snakes or things. So there was an interest in the living world quite early on, but heaven knows it might never have turned into something professional. When I was about 13 and an only child, my father thought it would be very good for me, and I agreed, but not too obviously, to be sent away to school. And the very first school we went to see was 100 miles north of New York City in the beautiful countryside of Dutchess County, named the Millbrook School. And it had a zoo. And I thought, that's sort of interesting. So without really knowing what I was doing to myself, I announced that that's where I wanted to go. I didn't want to look anywhere else. And thank goodness I got in. And sometime that summer, the big, thick envelope arrived, which told you how many pairs of socks, etc., you needed to bring with you. And there was also the material about what courses one was to take. And that school had the prescience to require biology in either the first or second year. So with great sort of prescience on my own part, I announced to my parents, I'll take it at the first year and get it over with. And they had a wonderful, charismatic, eccentric, brilliant biology teacher named Frank Trevor, who really taught a natural science-oriented kind of biology. And within 3 weeks, he had me hooked on biology for the rest of my life. And basically, I've just gotten worse and worse about it. I've been very lucky in having wonderful mentors and role models. And my next one turned out to be my freshman advisor, who I met on my very first day as an undergraduate at Yale, Philip Humphrey, who later went on to the Smithsonian and the University of Kansas, and was the person who introduced me to the Amazon in 1965. But also, there was the director of the Peabody Museum of Natural History, Dylan Ripley, another ornithologist interested in New Guinea, who then went on to become easily one of the 2 greatest secretaries of the Smithsonian Institution in its entire history, but who said, amongst other things, something that I never forgot, which was that every biologist with a conscience should spend some time on conservation. And then, of course, there was the legendary G. Evelyn Hutchinson, extraordinary intellect, one of the great founders of the science of ecology, who I finally got over my just fear and awe of the intellect enough so that I asked him to be the chair of my thesis committee. And Evelyn, too, cared about the environment. In fact, the most chilling thing I've ever heard said about atmospheric gases and the greenhouse problem was Evelyn saying, I do hope that the various things we are doing to the atmosphere will cancel each other out. But to be very candid here, what I really wanted to be was a 19th century biologist and have scientific adventures in remote parts of the world, studying animals and plants and natural history that few people ever got to see, and do it in a way that took advantage of 20th century transportation and other conveniences of the sort. So it was inevitable that I would end up going to some remote place. It was pretty much accident that it turned out to be the Amazon. And Phil Humphrey, who had already then moved on to the Smithsonian, had started a relationship with the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation, when it was started, was set up primarily to remove the world of the great scourges. And the one that they were successful with was yellow fever. In the process of doing that, however, they discovered that there were not just dozens, there were hundreds of other arthropod-borne viruses. And they thought it was very important to study these, get to understand their epidemiology and what their potential was to create human disease. And so they set up a series of laboratories around the world, which were world-class laboratories. They worked very well because they not only had people who could do sort of the virology, they also had people who understood natural history, so that the ecology of the disease organisms could be properly understood. One of these was at the mouth of the Amazon. And Phil Humphrey had started a little project there, and so he said, I think if you write a letter to this man, you might get the money to go spend the summer in the Amazon. And so in June of 1965, I washed up with Phil, his son, and a friend of his son in the Beileng airport, probably at 2 o'clock in the morning. And lo and behold, there was a future Tyler Laureate on the same plane, Charles Elton, who was visiting the tropics and this laboratory, but visiting the tropics for the very first time in his life. The Amazon in 1965 had one road in the entire Amazon. And we're talking here about a wilderness the size of the 48 states. One road in it, 2 million people in the Brazilian part of it, so maybe 3 million in the total Amazon. This indeed was a place to have an adventure. But the first sort of disturbing event leading to the current situation had already taken place, which was the building of a road from the port city of the Amazon, Belém, to Brasilia, the capital in the south interior of Brazil. And people were already remarking with sort of great wonder about the colonization pressure coming up that road and creating deforestation that nobody had ever sort of anticipated. So I did a PhD thesis studying birds in the lower Amazon rainforest. Discovered along the way that I'd started bird banding in Brazil. And got my PhD. And a couple years later, I was looking for a job. And somebody at the Smithsonian sent me a little note saying there was this organization called World Wildlife Fund, United States, which was looking for a project administrator. Now, I did not think that was a wonderful sounding title. I used to refer to myself as the petty bureaucrat. But here was this tiny organization which had 12 people. And they hired me and a secretary, number 13 and 14, and we became the program of the World Wildlife Fund. One of the things that was very strong about the World Wildlife Fund was its board of directors. It had good scientists who cared about the environment on that board, including George Woodwell. And we soon established the priorities for this tiny little organization. One, a strong emphasis on science. Two, a focus on the tropics, because there was just greater biological richness there. And we decided to concentrate on the Western Hemisphere because there really was no organization working actively in Latin America and the Caribbean, other than a few small national entities. And basically, we built that program over a period of 14 years, and then began to sort of ooze out beyond the Western Hemisphere. But there are a few important events that happened in that 14 years. One is, I remember having lunch with Ed Wilson about 1976 or thereabouts. And in retrospect, we were clearly talking about biological diversity. But the phrase did not exist. Really interesting to look back at that. Didn't come into existence until 1980. At which time Ed used it that year, I used it that year, and Elliot North did. And I used it, and one of the places I used it was in the Global 2000 report to the President of the United States, which was looking at all kinds of long-term trends that should be factored into policy development. And I was at first asked to do a section on endangered species, which would then fit into a section on wildlife, which would fit into a section on wildlife and forests. And I went back to them. I said, you know, the extinction problem is a lot bigger than you realize. We really should have a separate section here. And they were really great, and they listened to the argument and agreed that there would be a special section, which became the first real attempt to project global extinctions. We were also, at the time, reading a lot in the scientific literature about this theoretical discussion and hot controversy about whether a single large reserve would protect more species than a whole series of small ones, which would add up to the same total area. I mean, it's really great to have a controversy when there aren't any data to speak of. It can go on and on and on. But I was really worried about this because I was taking projects to the World Wildlife Board to protect this kind of habitat or that particular species. And it was not at all clear to me whether in the end they would succeed in fulfilling the intentions involved. So I used to worry about this subject and talk about it with some of my colleagues. And my friend Fran James, who was then at the National Science Foundation, told me that Daniel Simberloff, who was one of the protagonists in the controversy, was coming to Washington the week before Christmas, 1976. And why didn't I come over to the foundation and we would just talk about the subject? So I went over, talked about it with Fran and Dan and John Brooks, who actually had taught me beginning ecology at Yale. And I suddenly had this wild idea, which is that the law required Brazilians doing development in the Amazon that 50% of any project had to be left in forest. And I thought, hey, maybe you could persuade them to leave that 50% in a way which would be a giant experiment about fragmentation, where you could go in the forest and study it while it was still intact and continuous, and then after the deforestation creating fragments, you could follow the changes in the fragments, as well as compare what was going on with remaining intact forest. And that was the Monday before Christmas, 1976, and the following summer, the NSF gave me an air ticket to go to Brazil. They thought it was a wildly ambitious idea that it would come to nothing, but they gave me the ticket. And my newfound colleagues at the National Institute of Amazon Research in Brazil loved the idea, bought it. The local land authorities bought it. And now I was facing the much more difficult job of executing all of this. We planned it for 20 years. Well, it's now year 21. And it's clear I didn't have any idea what the rates of change would be. We certainly had just begun harvesting the answer to the simple question about big versus several small, and the birds show what everybody really anticipated. Forest interior birds show that more species remain in a large intact block, and the smaller the fragment, the more they lose, and the faster they lose them. And we learned a lot of other things along the way about the complex changes that go on, all of which sort of get factored into how you design and manage a protected area. But the other thing that was going on was I maintained Brazil as a major focus for myself personally and for some others at the World Wildlife Fund. I didn't try and cover everything else. I let other people do that. And I sort of had this theory, that this was a really big country, and if you could move things in Brazil, it might move things elsewhere. And so at one point I was actually asked to organize an environment briefing for the head of the Brazilian Foreign Service, which we did in New York City, which he later told me led their Foreign Service to set up a department for environment and human rights. And the association with the World Wildlife Fund continues, even though I left it in 1987 when the staff had grown to 150, tenfold increase. 1987, I sort of succumbed to one of my other longings, which was to use the museum world as a base for my scientific adventures and living on a interface with the public. And I really wasn't hired to do environmental work, although in those days the policy was if you were a scholar, even though you were doing administrative work, you were expected to continue to do scholarship, which I think was a very sound policy. And once Capitol Hill discovered there was somebody who knew something about environment, and particular rainforests, in the Smithsonian, they began beating a path to my door. And I won't tell you that full story. I just will tell you one short piece of it, but I think what became a very pivotal moment in my career. I had gotten to know Senator Tim Wirth, newly elected senator from Colorado, who cared a lot about the environment. And Tim had decided that it would be a good idea to take a congressional delegation to Brazil to look at the problem firsthand. So the Friday before Christmas, 1988, I'm the last person in the Smithsonian Castle, and the truth is that I was addressing Christmas cards. And the phone rings, and it's the senator from Tennessee, Al Gore, who I'd met at the Time Magazine Environment Conference. He's heard about the trip. He wants to go. I think that was the 23rd of December. Next morning, I'm at home. It's Christmas Eve. I'm wrapping Christmas presents. The phone rings, and it's my friend Kathy Phelps from Venezuela, but she's in New York, and she's read the newspaper, and I haven't. And she said, "I'm so sorry to hear about your friend." And she had read the story about the assassination of the chief of the rubber tappers, Chico Mendes, which my friend Marlise Simons of the New York Times had been smart enough to see buried in the newspaper in Brazil, and persuaded her editors to run it on the front page. And that changed a lot. It made Chico Mendes a well-known figure and name. It put a human face on what had been an abstract issue. 3 days later, Tim and Renworth come to dinner, dragging along Ben Bradley, the legendary executive editor of The Washington Post, who was so involved in Watergate and the Pentagon Papers, and his wife, Sally Quinn. They walk in the door. Sally barely says hello. She says in that good reporter way, "Is it too late for the environment?" And I explained it was too late for some things, but not for a lot of others. And that all turned into a major congressional delegation that went to Brazil in early January that year, in total spotlight because of the assassination of Chico Mendes. Suddenly, there we were in the Brazilian State Department, all the Brazilians lined up on one side of the table and all the Americans behind. The discussions being led on the Brazilian side by the head of the Foreign Service, who I had briefed about the environment a couple of years before. And Paulo Tarso Flecha de Lima was his name. And he has said subsequently to me that was when things began to change in Brazil, and also why Brazil eventually decided to host the Earth Summit in 1992. Well, enough storytelling. Looking back, what really worked? I look back and I see that over this whole period of time in working in conservation biology and conservation, that the lens with which I was looking at it all, I had to keep widening its aperture. I had to move from thinking about species to thinking about habitats to thinking about entire ecosystems and landscapes. I had to think about the economic drivers. I had to think about all kinds of social considerations. I had to learn to really understand how local communities relate to achieving conservation and avoiding negative trends. Listening was a big key to all of it. And you learn after a while that most environmental destruction is not done deliberately. Most people don't set out to hurt the environment. A lot of destruction comes in innocent, small increments which you add up, and then you can see that they're part of something bad. Certainly learned that one has to engage the private sector in addressing the challenge. It just gets larger and larger and larger, so that the capital flows that go into the Amazon today from private sources probably overwhelm those of multilateral or government sources by at least a factor of 10 or 20. And you find that all corporations are not the same. There are indeed some corporations that don't want to think about all of this, which really believe that they have a God-given right to every last unprotected tree on Earth. But then you find there are corporations that see the handwriting on the wall and get creative about it. And I think of the way in which Shell and BP Amoco, although they have legacy problems, have really faced the fact that we will come to a time when the era of fossil fuel is past, and that they are really energy companies, and if they're smart and want to get ahead in the end, they will look ahead and be creative rather than try and fight the inevitable. It's also clear there has been tremendous progress over this time. I mean, there was not a single national park in the Brazilian Amazon when I first went there. And now we're talking about an effort agreed upon by the Brazilian government, which will ultimately lead to at least 25% of the Brazilian Amazon in some kind of protected state. So there are indeed encouraging signs of progress. But we're still losing. You know, the scale of the challenge is still off the charts. In 1997, there was a smoke cloud as big as all of Brazil because of burning of the forests during a very dry El Nino year, and the intersection of that dryness with bad land use practice. There are now, instead of 2 million people in the Brazilian Amazon, there are 20 million people, and there's still a need to integrate the different sectors. That really needs to be done in almost every country. So there are big infrastructure projects being planned in the Amazon, and they don't really integrate very well with the conservation plan. And biggest of all, I think, if we actually manage to prevent the physical destruction of much of the remaining biological diversity on Earth, it's going to have to deal with the challenge of climate change. And that's a very big and serious challenge. And we need to actually determine, from a biodiversity point of view, what is the acceptable limit of greenhouse gas concentrations, as well as new strategies of planning land use so there's some ability of biological diversity to respond to those changes. I believe the acceptable limit is below doubling of pre-industrial CO2, currently scheduled to be where we'll get in about 2060. So there's a big challenge involved in all of that. So as we have the pleasure, Jared and I, of having some accomplishment celebrated, let's be mindful of how much there remains to be done, and how we need approaches and solutions that will work at the appropriate scale for the challenge. And if I would leave you with one thing, as you concern yourself with what you can do about all of this, please periodically lift your eyes to the horizon, remind yourself of the scale of the challenge, and let it redouble your efforts to come up with creative and even more effective solutions. Thank you.